So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Arpan Banerjee as our speaker for this evening. Many of you will know Arpan, who is a former chair of this society. He's also the current chair of the International Society for the History of Radiology. And Arpan has been very industrious researching and writing about the history of radiology for over 3 decades. He's published over 100 papers and essays, not to mention several books, including Radiology of AIDS back in 1993, Radiology Made Easy, and in a couple of editions, and also co-author of Classic Papers in Modern Diagnostic Radiology. More recently, on the history side of things, he's co-author of the History of Radiology and is also a co-author and editor of the book Pioneers in Radiology Worldwide, which came out in 2024 and is well worth the read. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Arpan for what I think will be a real treat.
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very, very much. Please come in back for coming this evening and giving up your time to listen to this topic. Now, it's going to be a personal history, so there will be some personal anecdotes. I cannot possibly cover the whole of the subject of radiology in 125 years of radiology, but it'll be a smorgasbord of interesting snippets from the discoveries that have been made over the last century and also the major developments in radiology, which, of course, you all depend on today for medical care. Now, I don't make any apologies for starting with this particular slide. This was Sir William Osler. And the reason I put them up is because when I first came to this medical school to study medicine, there used to be a library right at the end of the corridor, long corridor. And the library on the first floor had a beautiful view over the Houses of Parliament. And it was amazing that the librarian showed us around the library and said, this is where the anatomy books are and the physiology books are and all the rest. And this is a section on the history of medicine. Now, most of the history of medicine books, which are really valuable, were locked away. And a hospital like this has got a huge history, so you could imagine. But there was one shelf which was open to all the students and staff, which probably wasn't thumbed very often or used. And this was the book called Aequanimitas, which you see, which I picked up and read. Now, you thought I must be mad as an 18-year-old looking through this book, but this was a very, very good book for youngsters who were starting in the profession, because Sir William Osler was, in the early part of the 20th century, one of the greatest physicians Britain had. He was a professor of medicine in Oxford. He was poached by Oxford from the Johns Hopkins Medical School in America, which was probably the best medical school for clinical training at that time. And he was not only a brilliant clinician, but also a great writer and an essayist and a prolific writer, and had a command of the English language, which I wanted to emulate when I was 18. I never managed it, but I tried. And he had many great aphorisms. In these addresses to medical students and nurses and other workers, he wrote what we should do and his thoughts about the subject of medicine and healthcare in general. Diagnosis is our chief weapon. Well, that's pretty applicable to radiology. Absolute diagnoses are unsafe. So he's always telling you, this is 120 years ago, that always question what you come up with. Always have a doubt in the back of your head. Incorrect diagnosis leads to useless treatments. Well, we know that. And medical common sense is rare. And we all know that too, especially you learn that as you get older. He was also interested in the history in general. And he reminds us the past is always with us, never to be escaped. Inspiration comes from remembering the past. You see, what you need, what we all need, is to be inspired by people and contemplate, learn from the past. And the very first step towards success in anything is to become interested in it. Aren't there so many people who are doing jobs and things which they don't show any interest in? Terrible. That's what he would have thought. And see the future within the context of the past. That was said by Harvey Cushing. There's a Cushing's disease you will have heard of or read about. He was a neurosurgical professor and one of the first brilliant neurosurgeons. He was an American, very difficult man to work with, probably would have been sacked today by the management. Emile Elytra, on the other side of the English Channel, Frenchman. He was a polymath. He was a doctor and a philosopher and a historian. And he said that if the science of medicine is not to be lowered to the rank of a mere mechanical profession, it must preoccupy itself with history. It is the pursuit of the development of the human mind. This is the role of a historian. So you'd have thought that I'd start off a lecture on radiology with Röntgen. No, I'm not going to start him off Röntgen. I'm going to mention Ivan Puluj. Puluj was born in Ukraine. He studied theology and philosophy and physics in Vienna, and his doctorate was done under Professor Kund. Now, Professor Kund actually also supervised a man called Wilhelm Röntgen, who you've heard of. And interestingly, Puluj actually did research on cathode rays and produced what were the earliest X-rays, but he didn't realize he'd done so. And this was sad because obviously he's not really well remembered. The Royal Society did acknowledge his contributions and published his early papers. Here you can see this paper here. He became a professor of physics in Prague, and he realized that he had misidentified X-rays. When he heard of Röntgen's experiment, he went and did them and realized that he actually had discovered them earlier on, but he was never to be accorded the accolade that Röntgen, of course, got. He was a cultivated man and translated the Bible into Ukrainian. And in Ukraine, there are streets named after him and the university. And these actually are the first X-rays produced of coins. You can see the white areas are coins. They weren't produced by Röntgen. They were produced by Arthur Goodspeed and Jennings. Jennings was a British photographer, and Goodspeed was a physicist. And he was the first professor, well, sorry, he was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And he actually inadvertently created those X-rays in 1890. He didn't realize what he'd done, put them away. Terrible tragedy for him, because nobody remembers him today. He was Pennsylvania Medical School, incidentally, is the first medical school in the United States. And the first professor of radiology there was Henry Pencoast, who, if you are studying medicine, you will hear about because the apex, tumor in the apex of the chest X-ray is named after him. And he illustrates this famous quote by Louis Pasteur, a brilliant scientist from France, who said, "Chance favors only the prepared mind." Your mind has to be prepared. Otherwise, you ain't going to be able to put the associations together. And that's why Arthur Goodspeed here on the right is looking very unhappy, because his mind uncertainly was not prepared and is today not really remembered. Röntgen did his famous experiment on November the 8th, 1895. You all know about this. He did his experiment in a darkened room, encased a Crookes tube, which you can see like here, in cardboard. And then he noticed that the lighting up of a barium platinum cyanide screen as he moved it further away, and realized it can't just be due to anything, it must be due to something, and it was called X-rays. Sorry, right. And there you are, history was changed. Now remember, this experiment was done on a 5 o'clock on a Friday. He didn't Skype off home. He sat in his lab. He didn't believe that he'd actually discovered X-rays. He didn't believe himself. No self-belief. Did the experiment again and again and again. 10 o'clock, and his wife brings him his dinner. He knocks on the lab door, brings him his dinner. Said, "Röntgen, aren't you coming home?" Said, "I'm doing these experiments." So there you are. You have to be dedicated and really determined if you're going to make these great discoveries. And there is this famous communication, a new form of X-rays in the manuscript. And you can go and see his lab in Würzburg. He was a professor. He was 50 when he made his discovery. He was a professor of physics there. And that can be visited. It's the Röntgen Memorial. Bill Clinton has visited this place. And there is his original lab, his library. And you can see his lab here with all the old apparatus. It's there for us to go and visit and admire and learn from. This is his house where he was born. This is in Remscheid-Lennep in Germany. And a mile away from his birthplace. This is owned now by the German Radiology Society and is a museum, the Deutsche Röntgen Museum, dedicated to his life and work and radiology in general. Well worth a visit if you want to see something related. Right. Now, I did say, one of the lessons, sentences in my title was, what can we learn from the pioneers? Well, the first lesson you learn is nepotism has always been around. Very important nepotism. That's how the world works, I'm afraid. And Sidney Rowland, lucky man. He was a medical student. He was a medical student at Bath, not far away from here. And his uncle happened to edit the British Medical Journal. Oh, what luck. And he says to Sidney, I heard about this new thing called X-ray. Would you like to write an article in the BMJ? Man, what has started his career? And so he does. He describes this technique. And so it's a good start to his career. And he not only does that, he goes on and starts the first journal of radiology called the Archives of Clinical Skiography. You can see there. However, sadly, his heart wasn't really in radiology. He wanted to do microbiology, switched to microbiology. He was elected to the Council of the Röntgen Society, which is the first radiology society in the world. And he did research at the Lister Institute and sadly died of cerebrospinal fever in France during the First World War. And you can see the three societies, the early societies that were dedicated to radiology with the Röntgen Society, which later eventually becomes the British Institute of Radiology. And then there was the British Electrotherapeutic Society, which had got incorporated into the Royal Society of Medicine radiology section, which still is going today. And the Röntgen Society was founded by these three people. They had their first scientific meeting. It was a multidisciplinary society, so anybody with an interest in this new technique, including photographers and others, were allowed to join. And they had 40 medical people and 300 delegates at the first scientific meeting. This first president was the physicist Sylvanus Thompson, and they had his journal, as I mentioned. And surprise, surprise, everybody started squabbling. Get a group of different people with different specialties together, they all squabble. Nothing new. You're going on for hundreds of years. So they had to get this man here, Sir Humphrey Rolleston, who was a professor of medicine at Cambridge and president of the Royal College of Physicians and physician to the King George. He was a very, very distinguished physician of his day. He was interested in radiology and he helped bring this people together and form the British Institute of Radiology, which is still going today, of course, and had 600 members then. So we come to one of the early medical radiology departments, John McIntyre in Scotland. He was born in Glasgow, trained as an engineer, graduated in 1882 in medicine, worked as a naval surgeon. He was actually interested in ENT, ear, nose, and throat medicine. He created the self-illuminating endoscope and was the president of the Laryngology Society. And in 1896, after Röntgen's discovery, he set up the radiology department in Glasgow and produced some early cineradiographs. And he was the first pioneer of cineradiography. I'll show you a film from him, which he exhibited to the Royal Society a long time ago. And you can actually see, you'll be able to see, he was working on the frog's legs. He'll show you the hind legs of a frog moving. There you are. You can recognize the knee of the frog moving. And this is the first in the world. He then took pictures of the heart moving. Watch that, heart beating away. Can you see the heart beating away? That's fantastic, isn't it? I mean, this is 1896. Amazing. Then the bismuth meal. You have to swallow the bismuth. You can see the outline of the stomach here. This is the stomach. And you can see the duodenum. It's emptying the duodenum. And in the early days, when we used to do barium meals, we used to look for ulcers in the duodenum. So there we are. Sorry. Oh, okay. Right. Remember, radiation is harmful. I will illustrate that with a couple of stories. Clarence Daly, John Hall Edwards, and of course, Thomas Edison is an important man. He's the man who said genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I think that's what people forget. You have to perspire. before he could do really anything in life. And inventor. He was also a very shrewd businessman. You see, he didn't get filthy rich without being a shrewd businessman. He was self-taught. He didn't go to university. He had very poor hearing, so he was disadvantaged. And then he established his first lab in 1876, and he went on to have an outstanding number of patents, 1,000. He started off as a telegraph operator, but he invented the light bulb, the kinetoscope, moving film, the microphone, using it, phonograph, power generator, and rechargeable alkaline battery. Amazing man, absolutely amazing. And he had a glass blower. So the great thing about him was he delegated. He actually gave Nikola Tesla a job in his lab. That's another story. And Clarence Daly was his glass blower. So he was the man. There's Clarence Daly, sorry. I can't get a better picture of him. It's the only one there is in the world that I could find. And there is old Edison with his fluoroscope. And sadly, this man, didn't know much about the dangers of radiation. He worked on with calcium tungstate, whereas not going to use barium platinum, and he got radiation damage to his hands and the face. He developed cancer, and he eventually died quite young. And Edison gave up all his work and research on X-rays because he was very badly affected by the death of his glass blower, Clarence Daly. He didn't get to a very great age. And here's another man who had problems with radiation. He's local to me. I worked in Birmingham in my consultant years, and this is Hall Edwards, which you can see demonstrating X-rays in the field in Hodge Hill Common, which is in the East Birmingham, a poor part of Birmingham. And this is him eventually losing his arm. He also had X-ray radiation damage. He was interested in military radiology. You can see here he's X-rayed a bullet, and he wrote papers on this. And don't look away if you're squeamish. This is his amputated arm, which is in the path lab of the Birmingham Medical School. And there's the man without his arm. And he wrote about himself, effect of upon bone due to prolonged exposure to X-rays. There's the X-rays of his hand, which has been damaged by radiation. But he managed to paint, and he was one of the names inscribed in the Martyrs Memorial in Hamburg, St. George's Hospital, Hamburg. About 150 names are there of all the great martyrs who died in the early part of the 20th century. I keep getting the centuries wrong, 20th, 21st now to think when I was training as 20th. Okay. Antoine Becquerel, we must mention this very famous Frenchman, so with a bit of radioactivity. I'm going to try to please everybody. I'll probably end up pleasing nobody. And radioactivity, of course, didn't get quite the same publicity as X-rays did. However, we shouldn't forget him. He was a remarkable man, French professor of physics, came from an interesting family. He was interested in phosphorescence, heard about Röntgen's experiments, and he discovered radioactivity completely by chance. He published 7 papers on radioactivity in 1896, within 1 year of Röntgen's discovery, and he shared his Nobel Prize with the Curies in 1903. And here you can see the fogged plate, the Maltese cross, due to radiation exposure from uranium. And then, of course, we can't have a talk without Marie Curie, a remarkably brilliant lady, should be a role model for all female students in schools. She won the Nobel Prize for Physics, of course, for her discovery of radium, with her husband Pierre and Becquerel, as I mentioned, but went on to win another one for extracting radium and discovering polonium. Here is the second edition of the thesis from 1904, research on radioactive substances. And she had many achievements, including inventing the technique for isolating radioisotopes and using for cancer treatment. Of course, that's why you have the Marie Curie Foundation named after her. She discovered polonium and radium. She founded the Curie Institute in Paris and Warsaw. And during the World War I, she established military field centers, radiology and drove ambulances, and wanted to do something useful. And there was a great film made about her. called Madame Curie in 1943. That's Walter Pidgeon as Pierre Curie. That's Greer Garson, Marie Curie. This is one of their daughters. The Eve Curie wrote the biography of her mum. This is Irene Curie, who went on to marry another Nobel laureate, and she also won a Nobel Prize. What a family, eh? Father, mother, and one daughter and her husband, Nobel Prizes. And this interesting film had a screenplay written by Aldous Huxley, who some of you may have heard of. He wrote Brave New World, amongst other many, many books. He was a brilliant writer, came from the famous Huxley family. And it didn't win the Oscars. Guess what won the Oscars? Casablanca. Here's to you, kid. Okay. Now, Hans Geiger should be mentioned. He studied physics in Erlangen in Germany, and he went to work with Rutherford, and he did his famous Geiger-Marsden experiment, so he could count the alpha particles, and he developed a Geiger-Müller tube, which enabled the early detection of alpha, beta, and gamma particles. Very important. We have heard of Geiger counters. And then, of course, we should mention nuclear medicines takes off. George Ansell takes the first nuclear medicine image of a retrosternal thyroid, the old apparatus. That is Rotblat. Rotblat was a physicist who actually went on to win a Nobel Prize for Peace. Was part of a Pugwash conference and the Einstein-Russell Manifesto. Bertrand Russell, I'll mention a little later, was a famous pacifist and a brilliant mathematician and a philosopher, a rather divisive figure to some. And I also should perhaps mention Saul Hertz. He was the first person to use radioiodine to treat a patient with Graves' disease. He died at 45, age 45 of an MI. And then Hal Anger, one must mention Hal Anger. He was an electrical engineer. Of course, after a gamma camera, without that, you wouldn't have nuclear medicine now. A little bit of water break, sorry. Thank you. And there's a thyroid scan there for you. I said I'm going to put in these little pithy things. Persistence is required. And I'm going to illustrate that by 3 characters, an interventional radiology, and some injustice as well. Okay, the world is full of injustice. There's nothing new. This is Werner Forssmann. This is Seldinger. And this is Mr. Dotter, Charles Dotter, Dr. Dotter. Werner Forssmann, an amazing story. He qualified from Berlin in 1929, and he was working in a tiny town in Eberswald. No one's heard of it. And he was a maverick, okay? It's the mavericks, the nutters, you may say, today. We call them mavericks. They do things which everybody else wouldn't dare to do. They move things forward. And what he did was he self-experimented, and he stuck a catheter into his groin and pushed it up into his heart, went to the X-ray department and took a picture. And he said, I've got it, I can see the catheter. So, and he's bleeding away, people around watching him, trail of blood going to the X-ray department. And his boss sees what's happened, sacks him, immediately gets sacked, never works in cardiology ever again in Germany, and has to switch to urology, However, the Nobel Prize Committee in Karolinska Institute, Sweden, realized that an injustice had been done, and they awarded him a Nobel Prize. And it's interesting, but self-experimentation was not uncommon. The professor of physiology who taught me before I started medical school here was called Barcroft, and he has a father who was a professor of physiology at Cambridge, and he did lots of self-experimentation, and he'd sort of inhale cyanide gas to see how long he'd survive and measure his oxygen levels. They used to do bizarre experiments. Of course, today you would never get that through health and safety, and you would just not, you wouldn't be able to do it. You basically would not be able to do these pioneering experiments. And these were the real pioneers. They were not scared about dying or having bad health or whatever. They just went ahead and did things because things were more lax in those days. Sellinger's name is legendary in medicine because his technique has enabled us to do safe catheterizations. So you can have, when you have your coronary angiogram and stents and pacemakers put in, this is the man's technique. But you know what? They rejected his thesis. They said, there's not really enough. I mean, look at this line here. His chief said, I don't think this invention of the new technique is enough for a basis of a thesis. I can imagine that. And one of the theses that have been produced since, okay? So he had to go into another one, percutaneous transhepatic cholangiography. And I think what happened with him is he quit teaching hospitals and went and spent his whole life in a tiny little hospital called Mora. And he had a very successful, happy life there, I suspect. Dotter was a genius. He got nominated for the Nobel Prize, and he invented the technique of angiogram. It was completely by chance, of course. Well, that's another story. He actually dissected the artery. Since we did that today, that wouldn't be terribly clever. But anyhow, a new technique was born. You could dilate the arteries with the technique. He became a professor at age 32, wrote lots of papers. There's an old angiogram, which you had to do before these techniques. And Dotter was a polymath. He wrote a paper on cardiac resuscitation very, very early on, 1962. People were not doing chest massages or when you had a heart attack. He was a pilot. He liked climbing mountains. He was a good played classical music. He was a painter, photographer. Loved the outdoors. A complete polymath. Okay, it's my little break in the breaker slide. Sorry. Right. Now, the reason I put this slide in, just to remind you, because 1895 was not only the year Röntgen discovered X-rays, it was the year the Lumiere brothers in Paris described cinema. And cinema, of course, is a great entertainment and art form, which we've all grown up with and will probably carry on forever. And the first X-ray depiction was in this particular film. I was going to show it to you, but I couldn't check whether the copyright was free or not, so I didn't dare. 1897, X-Ray Friend. And then this is a very famous film, A Man with X-Ray Eyes, where this man puts drops in his eyes and he can see through everybody. And rather, at first, it's quite fun and of entertainment value, but then it really torments him. And I won't tell you in case you haven't seen it. It's a Roger Corman film, those who are film aficionados. And then there's this fantastic Voyage, a film, which basically a miniaturized submarine goes into the bloodstream, into the head, and finds its way around to someone who's collapsed. And that's was science fiction then. Today, of course, we do angiograms and we look at cerebral angiograms and you embolize things and so on. And so it's no more science fiction. But it was then, I can tell you. And okay, so we need to remember that advances occur unexpectedly and often requires cross-fertilization of specialties and ideas. You need to work collaboratively. And I'm going to illustrate that with CT, ultrasound, and MRI. This is Godfrey Hounsfield, and he had some struggles. He didn't get all the funding he needed to do his work, and he says that in his writings by himself. And he had to travel across London by public transport, which is no mean feat these days, I suspect. Probably was slightly easier than carrying bullocks' brains. There you are, for his experiments. And he didn't have a great start in life. He wasn't a brilliant student. He was a man who, liked to do things. And he went out and joined the RAF, didn't go to university, learned about radar and electrical engineering, joined EMI, the Electrical Musical Industries. Of course, that's got a connotation with the Beatles, but it wasn't the money from the Beatles that funded his research. It was the Department of Health. He was interested in computers, designed one, and became interested in the concept of CT scanning and introduced CT scanning, was introduced at Atkinson Morley in London with James Ambrose, the radiologist. He shared his 1979 Nobel Prize with Alan Cormack, the physicist from South Africa, who did some of the original work on the scanner as well. And that you probably some of you recognize is a bust of George Harrison. I only put that out because there is sometimes, obviously we think EMI, people think of the Beatles, because Beatles were signed to the EMI and did make a lot of money for them. But of course, by the time Hounsfield was doing his research, they'd actually split and gone to Apple and then gone their own ways. And it's interesting, at the time when Hounsfield was doing his final experiments and getting his clinical thing going, this gentleman produced one of the great albums of the 20th century. It was his album of existential angst. It has got some tracks in it like What is Life? I'm still trying to work that out. But All Things Must Pass is the title. Now, today, if he wrote this, it will be called All Things Must Pass, but not until they've had a CT scan. That's my only joke. CT scanner. There you are. Hounsfield prototype. And there's the mini computer. Okay. And there's the famous first clinical picture of the CT scan of the brain showing the cyst. Okay. Now, this changed the world. It changed medicine. It changed medicine forever. Everybody now has a CT scan for everything. And then we have the mad Professor Ian Donald. Ian Donald has a connection to this hospital, my alma mater. He also studied here. He studied medicine here, but he'd already done a degree in classics in South Africa. And he worked as a registrar in Obston Guiney. He had an interest in machines, which was rather unusual for a clinical professor. He collaborated with Tom Brown and so on. And I'm not going to go into much detail here because I haven't got time, but he traveled around with pathological specimens of ovaries and fibroids in his boot. Don't do that. That's a strikeable off offense by the GMC. Immediately, you will lose your license to practice. And if that had happened, there probably might not have been ultrasound, who knows? They also ridiculed him. Okay, all these people who were pioneers were ridiculed, but they didn't bother them. They carried on. That's a very important message. Don't get put off by people telling you things. And this is a famous paper. 1958, it produced this paper. And you wouldn't believe it. Cliff Richard was in the charts then. He still is, isn't he? Sometimes. There you are, the famous paper. And then we turn to the MRI pioneers. This illustrates another thing. I'll start off with Peter Mansfield. He failed his 11 plus. So, you don't have to do very well in your early life to be able to make great advances and have a very fulfilling life later. He studied physics, got a PhD thesis, and worked in Nottingham most of his life, discovered echoplanar imaging. And he tested the first full body prototype MRI scanner in 1978 and shared the Nobel Prize with Lauterbauer. Now, Lauterbauer was a chemistry professor, wrote this important paper in Nature, and he shared the prize. This man didn't get the prize, and he was very angry. And he probably should have got the Nobel Prize, but I am not a judge, and I'm not to say, it's not for me to say that, but the correspondence and the literature around what happened does show he was probably unfairly not given the prize. He was a child prodigy. He studied violin at the Juilliard, might have even been contemporaries with Neil Sedaka, I don't know, was a good tennis player. He got a maths degree before he did medicine, and he showed that tumors can be detected by MRI in a paper in Science. And he got a patent on MRI, and then he produced his company and then started building scanners. And there was this huge controversy. And he created a MRI-compatible implantable pacemaker with Wilson Greatbatch. But he never got his Nobel Prize. And it just goes to show, even at the highest levels, there are bitter rivalries. There are bitter rivalries everywhere, starting from school, when someone gets a gold star, someone else only gets a silver star, all the way through life. So this just illustrates it. And there's an old MRI machine. PET scanning, I ought to mention a little bit about PET scanning. We can't really mention PET scanning without going into some of the old pioneers who enabled it. Paul Dirac, he was a professor of maths at Cambridge, and in 1928, age 26, he wrote a very important paper, and he argued that electrons can have both a positive and a negative charge. And this laid the foundation for the discovery of the positron by this man, who was a physicist who also won a Nobel Prize. And he basically showed what Paul Dirac had predicted. And so there you are. And then we must mention this man, who was also another very clever man, full Professor 29. And he was the man who basically invented the cyclotron. And without that, of course, you wouldn't have all your isotopes. And he got a Nobel Prize in 1939. He worked on the Manhattan Project. You might have seen a film called Oppenheimer a couple of years ago. And there is Mr. Oppenheimer there. He looks a bit like the guy who played him, isn't it? And this film actually is very interesting because it's got quite a lot of the interesting physicists are portrayed in it. I've watched it 2 or 3 times carefully. Enrico Fermi has a part in it, as does Isidore Rabi, who also was important in MRI, the physics of. But an awful lot of mind you, a lot of clever physicists worked on the Manhattan Project, so it's not entirely surprising. And then we move to the Mass General Hospital. This is called man's greatest hospital. When I was there as a student, the Americans called it man's greatest hospital because that's what they thought. It is a very big hospital. And this physicist worked there on annihilation of radiation and did lots of early developments. Michael Phelps is another big name, and so on, David Cool. And I should mention John Mallard in Britain. He is important from the Aberdeen Research Group. So he was a British pioneer in Aberdeen who should be mentioned. And so I did say I was going to mention artificial intelligence. So I'll do that in a minute after my little glass of water. Thank you. Oops, sorry. Now, this is a big topic now. So I thought I'd put this in because 21st century is now, the last 2 years, I keep seeing artificial everywhere. Artificial intelligence is going to apparently take the whole world over, I'm told. I'm retired, so I don't know. But I thought I'd give you a little bit of the early history of artificial intelligence till the end of the 20th century, because beyond that, I'm not qualified to comment, and I am not up to date with the literature. However, from a historical point of view, this is when it started. There was a conference in Dartmouth College, a famous college in the United States, in 1956. And they basically, scientists and engineers got together, and they wanted to make intelligent machines. And they wanted the machines or the computers to perform cognitive tasks performed by the human brain. So your human brain can learn, and it can problem solve, and it can make decisions. Maybe the wrong ones, but hopefully the right ones. Your whole life, it involves you learning things, solving all the problems that are thrown at you, and trying to make the right decisions in every aspect of your life, your personal life, your financial life, and your medical life, or whatever field you're in. That's what you're trying to do. Now, go back to 1949. We thought in 1956, they thought that the Americans thought that's when it was invented. In 1949, George Orwell published 1984. Now, I don't know whether people still read it, but we read that as a student. And he described facial recognition systems, the telescreen. And he wrote this in 1949. He discovered digital transcription, scriptwrite. The versificator was mentioned, and that AI creates art. Now, there's George Orwell. George Orwell died very young from tuberculosis. Was one of my heroes because his prose was unbelievably brilliant. I loved his books. And there's another man, Somerset Maugham, who actually influenced him. So George Orwell was influenced by this man. Somerset Maugham is, of course, connected to St. Thomas's. And he wrote a book called Off Human Bondage, which was about his autobiographical days as a medical student here when he walked the wards of this hospital. And he never practiced medicine. He studied here. And in 1897, he had his first book published called Lisa of Lambeth. And he got so distressed by poverty and bad obstetric care, which he saw in Lambeth, that he decided he couldn't do medicine, he couldn't face it. And he went on and lived very long life and made his living by writing books, short stories, plays, etc. I used to love his books when I was young. And he's gone out of fashion now. And then finally, this man, he said, computers are useless. They can only, what did I say? They can only give you answers. They can't actually ask the questions. It's the questions that have to be asked. Correct question. That's, of course, Pablo Picasso. I think he knew a little bit about painting. Okay. And then there's this man who was wronged. We all know his story, so I'm not going to go into detail. But he was a very bright man. He was very badly treated by the establishment. And he worked in Bletchley Park, but he's actually the father of modern computing. And he gave a public lecture, suggested the machine can learn from experience. That's the crucial thing. And this is a very, very important paper, which Computing Machinery Intelligence, which was written in 1950. And then we come to the more recent pioneers. Norbert Wiener, name you may not have heard of, you may have heard of him. He was a very clever man, did a maths degree at 14, and then did zoology degree, and then he did philosophy. And he graduated with 17, and he did a PhD at 19 on mathematical logic. He went to work he did this on the works of Whitehead and Russell, who are professors of mathematics in Cambridge. And Russell was also a philosopher and writer at Cambridge. And then he went to work with, Norbert Wiener went to work with them. And interestingly, a little anecdote here, Bertrand Russell taught quite a lot of clever people, and the cleverest person he said he ever taught or met was a man called Wittgenstein. You may have heard of Wittgenstein, the philosopher. He's connected to this hospital. Do you know why? Because during the Second World War, he had his existential crisis, and he wanted to do something useful. And he was a porter at Guy's, portering medicines from the pharmacy department to the ward. And he wanted to be in disguise in case people recognized him. So he was probably the cleverest porter that walked this hospital. And this man, Norbert Wiener, we go back to him, he had poor eyesight, so he couldn't fight in the war. He was turned down for being a Jew. He worked at MIT, eventually became a professor. MIT is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He worked on anti-aircraft guns initially, and this led to his interest in information theory and cybernetics and feedback. And this is what the first forays into artificial intelligence, collaborating with these guys, and neuropsychologists, computer scientists, engineers, and so on. He was a very, very great pioneer. He died at 69 of a heart attack. Here he is giving a lecture. I bet you can't follow any of that. No, I can't anyhow. But this book is worth looking at. This is the pioneering book, Cybernetics, or Controlled Communication in the Animal and Machine. Very important book, which changed the world, really. And then we have the more recent people who were involved in artificial intelligence, which you know about. There's an American neuropsychologist and a doctor. He worked with cybernetics and neural networks. You've heard that term? Neural networks has been involved. And do you know 1947, they designed a machine that allowed the blind to read. I find this sort of thing very remarkable because, sometimes we think we've done, everything's just been done today. This is the important paper which enabled the neural network theory to help. And then, of course, you may have heard of this guy because he's more modern. And he was a computer scientist, and he wrote a very important book, which basically artificial neural networks, which is, of course, the basis of deep learning and all that sort of stuff. And in 1963, in the journal Radiology, computer diagnosis was used in primary brain tumor diagnosis. So, the people were using it a long time ago. And in the 1990s, Of course, chest and breast diagnoses were being made by computer-aided diagnosis. And I just mentioned him, Jan LeCun. He was in the news last year. He was the director of AI at Meta until last year. And he was the one who used convolutional neural networks to lead the way to deep learning. And because of deep learning, you've got chatbot and chat all this, and the computers are now sort of writing essays and doing all sorts of things, doing terrible things to maybe lose all your jobs. Who knows? James Belford, I must mention before I finish, only because he was an important Birmingham radiologist, local. He went into medicine late, qualified at age 35, became a brilliant bone radiologist, wrote this book. He actually founded the British Association of Radiologists, which then eventually becomes the Royal College, which had its 50th anniversary last year. That's why I mention him. He was an interesting man who had a very sad end and fell foul of management in his hospital and started saying things which, and picking fights with management and also making comments that, you didn't need biopsies for making a diagnosis and so on and so forth. He became rather extreme in his views. And it was really sad. And he had all his teaching duties taken away from him. But he was a pithy man with epithet. He liked his comments, he liked his aphorisms. These are quite useful because they're quite relevant today, as they were when he uttered them. Politics should have no place in hospital management. As long as you are happy, keep away from the specialist. If you are not feeling well, go to your doctor and pray that he will save you from the investigators. I think that won't happen today. You will almost certainly get investigated. And over-investigation is not a new phenomenon. He said that in the 1960s. So there you are, nothing new under the sun, eh? And then we come to this man. He is, of course, a gentleman from Liverpool. Oh gosh, I'm losing my brain. And he gave his first presidential address in Liverpool Literary Society. And when he said, Thurston Holland, who was the radiologist there, one of the early radiologists in Liverpool, who actually organized the first International Radiology Congress, 1925, last year. And he said, the 19th century of ours is the most wonderful the world has seen. In the case of operative surgery, we've almost reached the acme of this art, which illustrates predicting the future is futile. So what have we learned from all these pioneers? Well, we've learned that serendipity and luck are important factors in discoveries. We've learned that persistence and resilience are required. Hard work and being well prepared is important. Cross-fertilization of ideas lead to advances. Nepotism and unfairness have always been around. Bitter feuds and rivalries are common. Several pioneers and polymaths, some had poor school records. Predicting the future is futile. And so I come to Röntgen. I have to show you a picture of Röntgen. It wouldn't be right, would it? Talk about Röntgen and the famous hand X-rays. Well, what can we learn from his life? Well, he learned that life was unfair very young. He was accused of making caricatures of his teachers and was expelled unfairly. He hadn't actually done it, but he had to take the blame. He was not a brilliant student. He had a good mentor. So your mentor is very, very important. He did his early research, but that's not what made him famous. He stood on the shoulder of giants. That's an important thing to remember. He was a meticulous experimenter. He moved around a lot. He widened his experience. He was 50 when he made his famous discovery. He had hobbies. He was fond of mountain walking. Unfortunately, he fell victim to the financial climate of his time and lost a lot of his life savings during the crash. And he had friends outside his profession. He didn't like the company of physicists. And so I come to the end. And as I said, I've only managed to cover certain aspects in a talk as short as this. And hopefully it's given you a little flavor of how the subject of radiology has got here. And of course, hopefully it'll have another 100 years. And on that note, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you.